Adrian Moretti kicked the door open so hard, the wood splintered off its hinges. Richard Harrington stumbled backward, knocking over his desk, his face white as a dead man's. "You destroyed my father." Adrian said, his voice quiet, which made it 10 times more terrifying than if he had screamed. "You took 10 years from me, and tonight I'm taking everything from you." But then behind a locked door at the end of the hallway came a sound that stopped Adrian cold. A woman's voice, faint, desperate. "Help me. Please. Somebody help me." If this story already has your heart racing, subscribe to this channel and follow every part until the very end. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Adrian Moretti had not slept in 3 days. Not because he couldn't. Not because something was wrong with him. He hadn't slept because he had been waiting 10 years for this night, and he refused to close his eyes for even 1 hour and risk it slipping away from him. He sat in the back of his black car and stared at the Harrington estate through the rain-streaked window. The house was enormous, lit up from the outside, like whoever lived inside it wanted the whole world to know they had money, power, and the kind of arrogance that only comes from never being punished for anything in your life. Adrian had driven past this house before, many times. When he was 19 years old and his father's company was collapsing, he had stood outside these iron gates and begged for a meeting. He had called. He had written letters. He had sent people on his behalf. Richard Harrington had never taken a single call. And Adrian's father, a proud man who had built his shipping company from nothing, had died 18 months later. Heart attack. The doctors called it natural causes. Adrian called it murder by 1,000 betrayals. He buttoned the top button of his coat, checked his watch. Then he said to the man sitting in the front seat, "Tell me again." Marco, his head of operations, didn't need to ask what he meant. He had worked with Adrian for 8 years and knew exactly how the man's mind worked before a confrontation. Richard Harrington is inside, 3 security guards on the first floor, 2 upstairs. His wife is at their daughter's house in Connecticut for the week. He's alone except for staff. The financial documents. Our lawyers already have copies. The moment you walk out of that house, everything gets filed simultaneously with the SEC, the FBI, and every major financial publication in New York. Adrian nodded slowly. And the other thing, Marco was quiet for a moment. Our source inside confirmed it. Richard moved the last of the offshore accounts 3 days ago. He knows something is coming. He's been shredding documents. Good, Adrian said. That means he's afraid. He opened the car door and stepped into the rain. The security guard at the front entrance had barely registered what was happening before Adrian's people had already moved past him. Not with violence. Adrian had learned long ago that violence was loud, and loud things attracted attention. His men simply appeared, 3 of them all in dark coats, and within 45 seconds, the guard's radio was disconnected. His phone was taken, and he was sitting zip-tied in the security booth with a very calm man explaining to him that tonight was not a night to be a hero. Adrian walked through the front door of the Harrington estate like he owned it. Because tonight, in every way that mattered, he did. Richard Harrington was in his study on the 2nd floor. Adrian could hear the man's voice before he even reached the door, barking into a phone, sharp and irritated the way powerful men talk when they think nobody is listening. "I don't care what the lawyers say. I need this moved by morning." Adrian opened the door. Richard Harrington spun around. He was 64 years old, broad-shouldered but gone soft around the middle. Silver hair perfectly groomed even at 11 o'clock at night. The kind of man who had always looked like money, talked like money, and used money as a shield against every consequence life tried to throw at him. Until tonight. The phone dropped from his hand. "Adrian Moretti," he said, and his voice, for all his effort to keep it steady, cracked on the last syllable. "Hello, Richard." Adrian stepped inside the room and closed the door behind him. He pulled out the chair across from the desk and sat down like a man who had all the time in the world. "Sit down. You can't come into my house." "Richard." Adrian's voice didn't rise. It got quieter. "Sit down." Something in the stillness of that command made Richard Harrington's body obey before his mind could argue. He sat, Adrian looked at him for a long moment. He had imagined this moment for 10 years. He had rehearsed it. He had expected to feel something enormous rage triumph, something volcanic. Instead, he felt something he hadn't anticipated. Contempt so deep, it felt almost like boredom. "You don't even remember him," Adrian said. "Do you?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're—" "Joseph Moretti." Adrian said the name like he was placing a stone on a grave. "My father. He came to you in 2014. His company was facing a liquidity crisis because your firm pulled its contracts 6 months ahead of schedule with no warning. He called your office 43 times. You never took one call. Business decisions. He died," Adrian said. 18 months later, he died knowing his company failed, knowing he couldn't provide for his family, knowing that the man who put him in that position never suffered a single consequence. He paused. "Until tonight." Richard's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "Whatever you think you have on me." "I don't think I have anything on you," Adrian said. "I know exactly what I have. Every offshore account, every falsified contract, every political donation made in exchange for regulatory protection, every partner you threw under the bus when the risks got too high." He reached into his coat and set a single folder on the desk. "That's the summary. Our lawyers have the full documentation. It's being filed as we speak." Richard stared at the folder and didn't move to touch it. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rain against the windows. Then something shifted in Richard's face. The fear was still there, but something else moved behind it. Something calculating. "You came all the way here," Richard said slowly, "just to tell me you filed documents. You could have done that from anywhere in the world, Moretti. You didn't need to come here personally." He tilted his head slightly. "So what do you really want?" Adrian looked at him. "I want you to know that I was the one who did it," he said simply. "I want you to know what it feels like to watch everything disappear and understand there's not one thing you can do about it." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly he said, "You're more like me than you think. Don't flatter yourself. I'm serious." Richard leaned forward slightly. "You spent 10 years rebuilding yourself. You became this." He gestured vaguely at Adrian. "The suits, the power, the empire. You think you're different from me because your reasons were personal. Every man who ever built an empire did it because something personal drove him. You and I are exactly the same kind of man." Adrian stood up. "We're done here," he said. "Your father would be horrified," Richard said, and his voice had sharpened into something deliberate. "The man you described, a man who built something honest. You think he'd be proud of what you became to get revenge on me?" Adrian had started walking toward the door. He stopped. He didn't turn around, but he stopped. "I think," he said quietly, "that you should stop talking now." "He wouldn't recognize you," Richard continued. "The son he raised wouldn't walk into someone's home and—" I said stop. "Wouldn't run a criminal organization, wouldn't threaten people, wouldn't become exactly the kind of man who destroyed him in the first." Adrian turned around. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He placed both hands flat on Richard's desk and leaned forward until they were 12 inches apart. "You want to talk about what my father would think?" His voice was a cold whisper. "My father spent the last year of his life not sleeping, not eating properly, calling every contact he had begging for a lifeline that never came. He lost 30 pounds. He stopped talking at dinner. He apologized to my mother every single night for something that was never his fault. I watched that man disappear slowly, painfully, completely. And every morning he woke up, the first thing he saw was the phone he hoped would ring with a call that never came." He held Richard's gaze. "Don't you ever put his name in your mouth again." Richard said nothing. For the first time tonight, he looked genuinely afraid. Adrian straightened up. He smoothed his coat. He turned to leave. And that was when he heard it. At first he almost dismissed it. A house this size at 11 o'clock at night had all kinds of sounds, pipes settling, staff moving somewhere on the lower level, wind against old windows. But this sound didn't fit any of those categories. It was coming from down the hall. Not the main hallway, a narrower corridor to the left, that Adrian's initial walkthrough had marked as storage or unused rooms. It was faint, almost below the threshold of hearing. A voice, a woman's voice. Weak, exhausted, like someone who had been calling for a long time without anyone answering. Adrian stood very still in the doorway of the study. He heard it again. Behind him, Richard Harrington had gone absolutely rigid. Adrian turned around slowly. Something in Richard's face had changed. The fear that was there before, the fear about the documents, the exposure, the financial ruin that was still there. But underneath it, something worse had surfaced. Something older. Something that looked, when Adrian stared hard enough, almost like guilt. "What is that?" Adrian said. "Nothing. Too fast. Too flat. Old house. The pipes." "That is not a pipe." Adrian walked back into the hallway, not toward the exit, toward the narrow corridor on the left. "Moretti." Richard was on his feet. "You don't need to go down there. Whatever you think you're doing." Adrian kept walking. "There is nothing down there for you." The voice came again, closer now, more distinct. "Help me, please. Is somebody there?" Adrian stopped in front of a door at the end of the corridor. It was different from the other doors in the house, heavier, with a keypad on the outside instead of a standard handle. Not a storage room, not a utility closet. A room someone could lock from the outside. He turned back to look at Richard, who had followed him into the hallway and was now standing 10 feet away with his hands clenched at his sides. "Richard," Adrian said very carefully, "open this door. You're interfering in a private family matter. Open the door, or I take it off the hinges." Richard didn't move. "Last chance," Adrian said. Richard's jaw worked like he was trying to form words and couldn't. His eyes went to the door and then back to Adrian, and in that look, Adrian read something that turned his blood cold. This wasn't new. Whatever was behind this door, it wasn't something that happened recently. The guilt on Richard Harrington's face wasn't the guilt of a man caught in the middle of something. It was the guilt of a man who had been living with something for a long, long time. Adrian stepped back and looked at the keypad. Then he looked at Marco, who had materialized silently in the hallway behind him. Marco nodded once and stepped forward with a small device. It took 90 seconds. The lock disengaged with a soft click. Adrian pushed the door open. The room was not large. There was a single window small high on the wall, letting in almost no light. A narrow bed. A table. Books, dozens of them stacked against the walls. And in the corner, sitting on the edge of the bed with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. A woman. She was thin, not fragile thin, but the kind of thin that comes from too little fresh air and not enough of anything. Her hair was dark, pulled back simply. She might have been in her mid-30s. She had dark eyes that were sharp and clear and showed no sign of the confusion or instability or whatever story Adrian would have expected from a person found in a locked room. She looked at Adrian. Then she looked past him at Richard in the hallway. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She sat very still for a moment, and then she turned her eyes back to Adrian and asked in a voice that was calm and utterly serious, "Are you here to hurt them?" Adrian opened his mouth, closed it. Of all the things he had anticipated hearing tonight, that was not one of them. "Who are you?" he asked. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if she had forgotten it might be a question someone would ask. As if she was so accustomed to being invisible that the idea of her identity being unknown was genuinely surprising. "Lillian," she said. "Lillian Harrington." The silence that followed was so complete that Adrian could hear his own heartbeat. Behind him, Richard said nothing. He had not moved from the hallway. But his silence was the loudest thing in the room, because Adrian knew the name Lillian Harrington. He had researched every member of the Harrington family before this night. Every profile, every financial connection, every detail. And in all of that research, Lillian Harrington appeared only once in a brief society column from 8 years ago, noting that Richard Harrington's daughter from his first marriage had left the family to pursue interests abroad. No photos, no follow-up coverage. No social media presence, no public records, nothing. A person who had simply ceased to exist on paper 8 years ago. Adrian looked at this woman sitting in a locked room in her father's house. And for the first time in 10 years, his carefully constructed plan for this evening completely fell apart. "How long?" he said. Not to Richard, to Lillian. She didn't look away from him. 7 years, she said. Give or take a few months. 7 years. In a room. While the world believed she was somewhere in Europe, living a quiet life. Adrian turned around and looked at Richard Harrington. And something happened inside him that he didn't fully understand in the moment. Some shift, some realignment of everything he had thought this night was about. The fury he had carried for 10 years was still there. But now it had company. Something that felt uncomfortably like rage on someone else's behalf. "Richard," he said. And his voice was different now, quieter in a way that went beyond his usual controlled stillness. Quieter, in the way that comes right before something breaks. "Start talking." Richard talked. Not because he wanted to, but because he was a man who had spent 60 years calculating odds, and the odds in this hallway were not favorable. He talked in the way guilty men always talk sideways. With justifications wrapped around confessions. With explanations that were supposed to make things sound reasonable, but only made them sound worse. Lillian, he explained, had become a problem. 7 years ago, she had been working inside the family's financial operations. She had discovered irregularities. His word irregularities, as if it were a paperwork error, rather than a decade of systematic fraud. She had confronted him about it. She had threatened to go to the authorities. She was unstable, Richard said. Emotionally volatile. She wasn't in a position to make rational. "She was going to expose you," Adrian said flatly. "She had no idea what she was talking about. So you locked her up." "I protected her. For 7 years. She was a danger to herself." "Richard." Adrian's voice cut through the air like something physical. "Stop talking." Richard stopped. Adrian stood in the hallway and breathed very deliberately for a moment. He was not a man who lost control. He had spent years cultivating the ability to remain absolutely still inside, even when everything around him was chaos. It was what made him effective. It was what made him dangerous. But standing in this hallway, looking at this door, thinking about 7 years. He was working very hard. He turned back to the room. Lillian was still sitting exactly where she had been. She had been listening to the entire exchange without visible emotion, not detached, not numb, but with the kind of careful composure that Adrian recognized as the composure of someone who has survived a very long time by keeping themselves tightly held together. "I'm going to get you out of here," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then very carefully she said, "You didn't answer my question." He blinked. "What question? Are you here to hurt them?" He looked at her. "I came here to destroy Richard Harrington's business and financial reputation. Make them suffer the way my family suffered." "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up slowly, like someone whose legs had decided to stop trusting them, and she looked at him steadily. "I have evidence," she said. "I've spent 7 years in this room. Do you know what I did with 7 years?" She gestured briefly at the stacked books. "I kept records. Everything he told me over the years, thinking I couldn't do anything with it. Every visitor who came through this house. Every conversation I could hear through the walls. I have dates, names, transaction amounts I overheard, connections he didn't know I was putting together." Adrian stared at her. "You've been building a case," he said slowly. "I've been surviving," she corrected. "The case was how I survived. It gave me something to do that wasn't falling apart." He stared at her for another long moment. Then he looked at Richard. Then he looked back at her. "We need to go," he said. "I know," she said. She picked up a single notebook from the stack nearest to her, thin, worn, the cover soft from handling, and held it against her chest. Then she walked toward the door. She paused when she drew level with Adrian and looked up at him. "I don't know who you are," she said quietly. "But whatever you came here for tonight, I want you to know that whatever happens to them, I'm not doing it for revenge." She held his gaze. "I want the truth to come out. That's different." Adrian said nothing. He stepped aside so she could walk through the door. As she passed into the hallway, moving carefully, like someone relearning how much space they were allowed to take up. Adrian looked at Richard Harrington one last time. Richard looked at his daughter's back with an expression that Adrian couldn't quite name. It wasn't remorse, not quite. It was something more complicated than that. Something that might have been remorse once years ago before it calcified into something else entirely. "Whatever you had planned for tonight," Richard said quietly. "This changes things." "Yes," Adrian agreed. "It does." He followed Lillian out of the hallway. Behind them, he could hear Richard Harrington sit back down in his study. Not running, not calling for help, just sitting. Because a man who has just watched everything he buried come walking back through the door doesn't run. He just waits to find out how bad it gets. In the car. Marco drove without speaking. The two men who had accompanied Adrian inside were in a second car behind them. Lillian sat in the back seat with her notebook in her lap and her hands flat on top of it, and she looked out the window at the rain-soaked city moving past with an expression Adrian couldn't read. He sat on the opposite side of the seat and watched her without trying to hide that he was doing it. She noticed. She didn't comment on it. After several minutes, she said without turning from the window, "You were going to destroy them financially." "Yes." "With evidence of the fraud." "Yes." "My evidence would have been stronger." She said it simply without any particular inflection, just a statement of fact. Adrian considered this. Probably. "But you didn't know I existed." "No." She was quiet for another moment. "My father is very good at making things disappear," she said. "He's been doing it his whole life. People, problems, history. He's very good at editing the story, so only the version he wants survives." "I know," Adrian said. "He did it to my family too." She turned from the window then. She looked at him directly for the first time since they had left the house, really looked at him. The way you look at someone when you're actually trying to understand them, not just assess whether they're a threat. "Tell me," she said. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation, almost gentle. And Adrian Moretti, who had not told anyone about his father in longer than he could remember, who had kept that story locked away because it was the most personal thing he owned, and he had learned long ago that personal things were vulnerabilities, found himself talking. He told her about his father, about the contracts, about the 43 unreturned phone calls, about watching a proud man slowly lose the ability to believe he deserved to exist in the world. He didn't tell it dramatically. He told it the way he always thought about it, in clear, factual terms, because that was the only way he could tell it without losing control of himself in the back of a moving car at midnight. Lillian listened. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't offer sympathy in the way people usually did with big words and soft expressions that were really about their own discomfort with someone else's pain. She just listened completely the way someone listens when they understand from personal experience that sometimes the only thing a person needs is for someone to actually hear them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Richard didn't just pull those contracts on your father by accident." Adrian looked at her. "Your father's company had something Richard wanted," she said. "A shipping route. A regulatory connection. Something." She turned back to the window. "He never destroys things randomly. He always wants something. That's how I know." She paused briefly. "That there's more to your father's story than you've found yet." The car moved through the rain. Adrian sat very still, and for the first time since he was 19 years old and standing outside iron gates in the rain, he felt something shift inside him. Not the rage that had kept him moving for a decade. Something else. The uncomfortable, unwelcome, completely disorienting sensation. That this story, his story, the one he had told himself 10,000 times, was not finished yet. And that the woman sitting across from him in this car, with a worn notebook pressed against her chest and 7 years of silence behind her eyes, might know something about the ending that he didn't. Marco turned the car into the underground garage of Adrian's building. The rain beat steadily against the city above them, and Lillian Harrington looked out the window at the concrete walls closing in around her and took a long, slow, deliberate breath, like someone remembering what it felt like to breathe in a space that nobody could lock. They thought she had disappeared. They thought she was erased. But the woman they buried in that room had spent 7 years preparing for exactly this moment. And the man who came to destroy her family had just become the only person in the world who knew she was still alive. She ate like someone who had learned not to trust that food would keep coming. Adrian noticed it the first morning. He had told his housekeeper to set out breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just coffee toast, eggs, fruit, and Lillian sat down at the table and ate with this particular kind of focused stillness that had nothing to do with enjoyment and everything to do with discipline. She didn't pile her plate. She didn't rush. But there was something in the way she kept her hands close to her food, something in the slight tension in her shoulders when someone walked past the table that told Adrian more about the last 7 years than anything she had said in the car the night before. He didn't comment on it. He poured his coffee and opened his laptop and let her eat in whatever way she needed to eat. After a few minutes, she said without looking up, "You're watching me." "I'm working," he said. "You're doing both." He looked up. She was looking at him now, direct calm, with those dark eyes that had a way of making him feel like she was reading the fine print of whatever he was thinking. "Old habit," he said. "Reading people, noticing things." She considered this. Then she looked back down at her plate. "I do it too," she said. "I had to in there." You learn to read everything when your entire world is one room and the only information you get about the outside comes from what you can hear through walls. He set down his coffee cup. "What could you hear? More than my father knew." She looked up again, and there was something that was almost a smile, not warm exactly, but sharp. The smile of someone who had turned disadvantage into advantage and found a quiet satisfaction in it. He never soundproofed that corridor. I could hear conversations from his study on quiet nights. I could hear when his business partners visited. I kept a calendar. I dated everything I heard. "That's in the notebook." "Notebooks," she said. "Plural. There are 4 of them. I had Marco bring the bag from the room last night." Adrian went still. He had told Marco to go back for whatever she wanted from the room. He hadn't asked what that meant. He had assumed clothes, maybe. Personal items. "How many notebooks?" he said. 4 full ones and a 5th that's about halfway done," she said. 7 years of records." She picked up her coffee cup with both hands and held it the way someone holds something warm when they've gone without warmth for a long time. Dates. Names. Transaction amounts I could piece together from conversations. Business connections my father made and then buried. Names of politicians I heard mentioned in ways that would interest certain federal investigators. Adrian stared at her. "Lillian," he said slowly, "you built a 7-year intelligence file on your father's criminal operations from inside a locked room." She looked at him steadily. "I told you last night. It was how I survived. I had to believe I was doing something with the time, or the time would have done something with me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to see those notebooks." "I know," she said. "That's why I told you they existed." His legal team arrived at 10 o'clock. 3 people. His chief counsel, Daniel Yates, who had been with Adrian for 6 years and had the particular quality of never visibly reacting to anything. A financial crime specialist named Rosa Kim, who had come from the U.S. Attorney's Office 4 years ago and understood exactly how federal prosecutors thought. And a forensic accountant named Paul Sheridan, who could look at a string of numbers and tell you a story most people couldn't read in 1,000 pages of documentation. They sat around the conference table in Adrian's private office. Lillian sat across from them with all 5 notebooks laid flat in front of her. Daniel looked at the notebooks, then at Lillian, then at Adrian. "This is Richard Harrington's daughter," he said. "Yes," Adrian said. "The one who was reported to have left the country 8 years ago." 7 years ago, Lillian said quietly. "And I didn't leave. I was locked in a room in the east corridor of the house." The room was very quiet. Rosa Kim leaned forward slightly. "For 7 years?" "Yes." "You have documentation." Lillian opened the first notebook and turned it to face them. "Every entry is dated. I tracked dates using the news I could hear from my father's study, and twice a year the housekeeper who brought my meals would tell me the date." I don't think she realized she was doing it, she'd just mentioned it in passing. I cross-referenced everything I could. The dates are reliable. Rosa looked at the notebook. Then she looked at Adrian with an expression that said several things simultaneously, and all of them were serious. Paul Sheridan reached across and gently pulled the second notebook toward him. He opened it. He read for less than a minute. Then he looked up. "These transaction amounts," he said. "Where did you get these?" "Conversations I heard through the wall," Lillian said. "My father had a habit of pacing his study when he was on the phone. The wall between his study and the corridor that led to my room was thinner than he knew." Paul looked at the notebook again. "These amounts correspond to—" He stopped himself. He looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at the notebook. She looked at Adrian. "We need to cross-reference these against the documentation your team already compiled," she said. "Obviously," Adrian said. "If they match, they'll match," Lillian said. "Not arrogantly, flatly, the way you say something when you know because you were there." Rosa held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that means, "I believe you, and I am going to proceed accordingly." Daniel cleared his throat. "There's a separate issue," he said. He looked at Adrian. "If Lillian Harrington has been confined without consent for 7 years, that is a criminal matter entirely separate from the financial fraud case. We're talking about unlawful imprisonment, potentially aggravated. The moment we bring this to federal authorities, it opens a second case that runs parallel to the financial crimes. That changes the prosecution strategy significantly." "It changes everything," Rosa said. "Richard Harrington facing financial fraud charges is serious. Richard Harrington facing financial fraud charges and unlawful imprisonment of his own daughter is catastrophic. Judges look at those cases differently. Juries look at them differently. The media looks at them very differently." Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Lillian knew it too. She had known it for years. She had lain awake in that room and thought through every legal angle, every procedural pathway, every possible complication. She had had nothing but time and a sharp mind and the absolute refusal to let herself stop thinking. "I want to be clear about something," she said. Everyone looked at her. "I am not doing this for revenge," she said. "I need you all to understand that because it is going to affect decisions about how we proceed." She looked around the table at Daniel, at Rosa, at Paul, and finally at Adrian. "I don't want my father destroyed because he destroyed me. I want the truth recorded. I want the people he hurt. The employees who lost jobs, the investors who lost money, the people whose cases were buried because he bought protection. I want those people to have something. A record, accountability, the truth on paper." Daniel opened his mouth. "Don't tell me that's not how the law works," she said. "I know how the law works. I've had 7 years to study it." She touched the cover of the nearest notebook. "I'm telling you what I want, so that when you make recommendations, you know what you're working toward." A beat of silence. Then Rosa Kim smiled just barely, the corner of her mouth, brief and professional. "Okay," she said. "We can work with that." They worked through lunch. Adrian had food brought in, sandwiches, water, coffee, and nobody stopped. Around 2 in the afternoon, Paul Sheridan looked up from the notebooks and said quietly to nobody in particular, and everybody simultaneously, "I need everyone to stop for a second." Everyone stopped. "These entries from 2016, he said. He turned the notebook so the others could see the page. "These transaction amounts, these names." He pointed to a name written in Lillian's careful handwriting. This entity, Vantage Capital Consulting. This was one of the companies that filed the original complaint against Joseph Moretti's shipping company. The room went absolutely still. Adrian looked at the notebook. He recognized the name. Of course he recognized the name. He had spent years tracing the paper trail of his father's collapse. Vantage Capital Consulting had appeared early in that trail, a firm that had filed regulatory complaints and withdrawn contracts within weeks of each other. He had investigated them thoroughly and hit a wall of shell companies and offshore structures that had taken years to partially untangle. "What about it?" he said. His voice was careful, very careful. Paul pointed to the entry. According to this, in the spring of 2016, Lillian overheard a conversation in which Vantage Capital was mentioned in connection with the Harrington family's operations, with payment for services rendered. He paused. The amount listed here corresponds to the period immediately before the regulatory complaints were filed against Moretti Shipping. Adrian read the entry. Then he read it again. Then he set the notebook down very slowly. Richard Harrington paid Vantage Capital, he said. Not a question. He paid them to destroy my father's company. That is what this appears to indicate, Paul said carefully. Why? Adrian said. What did he want from my father's company? Paul turned to another page. Then another. He was moving quickly now, cross-referencing his finger tracing between entries. Then he stopped. The Moretti shipping routes, he said. Specifically the contract your father held with a government logistics supplier. According to these entries, he looked up at Adrian. Richard Harrington wanted that contract. He had a competing firm positioned to absorb it the moment Moretti Shipping collapsed. The regulatory complaints were designed to force the government to pull the contract and reassign it, which is exactly what happened. Adrian sat back in his chair. 10 years. He had spent 10 years believing that his father's destruction was about power. About an arrogant man who crushed smaller businesses because he could, because it was convenient, because it was profitable in some general way that he had never fully traced. He had never known there was a specific target, a specific plan, a specific payment. Richard Harrington had not destroyed Joseph Moretti carelessly. He had destroyed him deliberately, methodically, for a specific business objective, and then walked away without a second thought. Adrian became aware that Lillian was watching him. He looked at her. Her expression was careful. Not triumphant. She wasn't the kind of person whose expression went triumphant. But there was something in it. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who has been waiting for another person to understand something she already knew. You knew, he said. I suspected, she said quietly. I heard the name Moretti once years ago, in a conversation where my father was talking to someone about a shipping contract and how cleanly it had been handled. I wrote it down because I write everything down. I didn't know who Moretti was. I looked you up in the newspapers I could sometimes access. She paused. I found your name about 3 years ago. After that I understood why the name had been mentioned. You've known for 3 years that my father's company was connected to your family. I've known for 3 years that there was a connection, she said. I didn't know all of it. I didn't know the amount of it. She looked down at the notebooks. But I suspected this conversation today was going to happen eventually. That's why I told you about the notebooks last night. Not just because they help your case, because you deserve to know. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. Daniel, Rosa, and Paul were all looking at their own notes, pretending not to be in the room. The professional instinct of people who understand when a conversation has moved past the professional. Finally, Adrian said, How did you know I'd come? I didn't, Lillian said. But I hoped someone would eventually. And whoever it was, she looked at him. I wanted them to have the full truth, not just the pieces of it. At 4 in the afternoon, Adrian's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. Mr. Moretti. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, and deeply familiar in the way that voices are familiar when you've researched someone and heard recordings of them and spent years thinking about them without ever actually speaking to them. This is Thomas Harrington. Adrian sat up. Thomas Harrington, Richard's son, 41 years old, the one who ran the legitimate face of the family's business operations. The one who appeared in press photos, gave interviews, made charitable donations, and maintained the public fiction of the Harrington family as a pillar of the New York business community. The one who had said nothing for 7 years about his sister. Thomas, Adrian said. His voice was completely steady. I wondered when you'd call. I'd like to meet, Thomas said. No. A pause. Excuse me. You want to meet because you want to understand what I have, what I plan to do with it, and whether there's a negotiation to be had, Adrian said. The answer to all 3 of those things is everything, use it and no. So a meeting would waste both of our time. Another pause. Longer. My sister, Thomas said. His voice had changed slightly. Some professional smoothness had slipped. Is she all right? Across the table, Lillian had gone still. She could hear the conversation. Adrian hadn't put it on speaker, but he was holding the phone close enough that in the quiet room, the voice was audible. Her face was perfectly controlled, but her hands flat on the table beside the notebooks had pressed down hard against the surface. She's safe, Adrian said. I want to speak with her. She'll decide if she wants to speak with you. She's my sister. She spent 7 years locked in a room in your father's house, Adrian said, and something in his voice changed on those words, flattened and sharpened at once. Were you aware of that silence? Thomas, Adrian said. I'm going to ask you one more time. Were you aware that your sister was in that room? The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. I knew she was being held, Thomas said finally. I didn't know for how long. I thought it was temporary. In the beginning. I thought. You thought, Adrian said. I should have. Yes, Adrian said. You should have. He looked across the table at Lillian. She was still looking at her hands on the table. Very still. The stillness of someone holding themselves together through sheer practice. Don't call this number again, Adrian said to Thomas. And he ended the call. The room was quiet. After a moment, Lillian looked up. Her eyes were dry. She was not crying. She was not going to cry, that much was absolutely clear. But there was something in her face that was harder to look at than tears would have been. The particular expression of someone who has had years to prepare for a confirmation and discovers that preparation doesn't make it land any softer. He knew, she said. He knew, Adrian confirmed. She breathed in slowly, held it, let it out. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady. Add him to the file. Rosa Kim, who had been watching this exchange, wrote something in her legal pad. Paul Sheridan did the same. Daniel closed his folder and then opened it again. Adrian watched Lillian, and he noticed something that he would think about later. The fact that in the moment, her brother confirmed he had known and done nothing. She did not collapse, did not rage, did not shut down. She processed it, adjusted, and kept moving. Like someone who has had to adapt so many times and in so many ways that even the worst confirmations have become just another thing to integrate and continue past. He found that he did not have a word for what he felt watching her do that. He only knew that it was something he had not felt in a very long time. That evening, after the lawyers had gone, Lillian sat alone in the living room with the 5th notebook open in her lap, not reading it, just holding it. Adrian came in and sat down across from her. You should eat something, he said. I ate. A sandwich at 2 o'clock isn't eating. I'm not hungry. I know, he said. Eat anyway. She looked at him. Are you always like this? Like what? Directive. Yes, he said without apology. She almost smiled. Not quite. Your people are afraid of you, she said. My people respect the boundaries of their job descriptions, he said. Marco looks at you like he's waiting for lightning to come out of your hands. Marco is dramatic. He seems very competent. He's both. She looked down at the notebook in her lap. Thomas called because he's afraid, she said. Not asking. Stating. He's not calling because he cares about me. He's calling because he wants to know how much exposure he has. Yes. I know that, she said. I know that, and it's still... She stopped. Adrian waited. It still lands, she said quietly. Even when you've prepared for it. Even when you've told yourself for years that it doesn't matter anymore. It still lands. Of course it does, he said. She looked up at him sharply, as if she expected him to say something more. To add a qualifier to soften it, to tell her it would be okay, or that she shouldn't let it affect her. He didn't. My father used to tell me I was too emotional, she said. That I couldn't see situations clearly because I let feelings cloud my thinking. He used it to dismiss everything I said, everything I discovered, everything I tried to tell him about what I found in the company's records. Your father, Adrian said, was afraid of exactly how clearly you could see. She looked at him. You built a 7-year intelligence file from inside a locked room, he said. On minimal information with limited resources through isolation and whatever psychological pressure he was putting on you the entire time. That is not emotional thinking. That is one of the most disciplined things I have ever seen. And I have known some very disciplined people. Lillian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Why are you being kind to me?" He looked at her. "What do you mean? You came here last night to destroy my family," she said. "And now you're—" She gestured slightly, as if searching for the word. "You're here. You're being careful with me. Why?" Adrian thought about this. He was not a man who answered personal questions quickly or carelessly. He thought about it seriously the way he approached every question that mattered. "Because you asked me if I was here to hurt them," he said finally. "And the fact that your first question after 7 years in that room was not help me or get me out, but are you here to hurt them?" He paused. "That told me something about you. About what kind of person survives 7 years and comes out the other side still thinking about something other than herself." She held his gaze. "I was thinking about myself," she said quietly. "I wanted to know if you were going to make things worse for me before they got better." "That too," he said. Both things were in that question. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the notebook. "We have a lot of work to do," she said. "Yes," he said. "Starting tomorrow." "Starting tomorrow," he agreed. She closed the notebook. Adrian stood to leave. "Adrian," she said. He paused. "Whatever you came to the house for last night," she said without looking up. "Whatever your original plan was, I know I complicated it. I know I changed the shape of something you'd been building for 10 years. She paused. I'm sorry for that." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Don't be," he said. He left the room. Lillian sat alone with the notebook in her lap and listened to the city outside the traffic, the distant sirens, the low, endless hum of 8 million people living their lives. Sounds she had not been able to hear for 7 years. She pressed her palm flat against the cover of the notebook and breathed. And somewhere across the city, in a grand house, where the lights were on, in a second-floor study, Richard Harrington sat at his desk and made a phone call to a man whose number was not saved under any name in any contact list he officially kept. A man who specialized in making problems disappear. The same man he had used 7 years ago. And as he dialed, Richard Harrington told himself the same thing he had always told himself at moments like this. That he was doing what was necessary. That the alternative was worse. That he had no choice. He had been telling himself that story for so long, he had almost stopped noticing that it was a story at all. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. Adrian was already awake. He was always awake before the city fully decided to be, when Marco walked into the kitchen with his phone held out, and an expression that Adrian had learned over 8 years meant bad news that was moving fast. "You need to see this," Marco said. Adrian took the phone. It was a news alert. Not one. 6 of them stacked in the notification bar, all from different outlets, all with variations of the same headline. Exclusive Mafia boss, Adrian Moretti. Kidnaps Harrington Harris family. He pleads for safe return. He read the first 3 words of the lead article and put the phone down on the counter. He stood very still for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, "Get Daniel on the phone. Get Rosa. Get everyone." "Already calling," Marco said. "And don't let Lillian see this before I talk to her." Marco nodded and left the kitchen. Adrian picked up the phone again and read the full article. It was thorough. Professionally thorough, the kind of thorough that doesn't happen by accident, that requires someone to have prepared the information in advance and simply waited for the right moment to release it. There were quotes from Richard Harrington expressing fear for his daughter's safety. There were quotes from Thomas Harrington describing Adrian as a known criminal with a history of violent intimidation. There was a photograph old from a surveillance file somewhere of Adrian entering a building that the article identified as connected to organized crime. There was no mention of locked rooms, no mention of 7 years, no mention of notebooks or fraud or Vantage Capital or any of the things that had been discussed around that conference table the previous afternoon. Richard Harrington had filed the story he wanted, and he had filed it first. Adrian set the phone down a second time and looked at the wall for a moment. He had underestimated the speed. He had known this was coming. Of course, he had known the moment he walked Lillian out of that house. The clock on Richard's counter-response had started. He had expected it. He had prepared for it. What he had not expected was 6 hours. 6 hours from the time he left that house to a coordinated media assault across multiple major outlets simultaneously. That kind of speed required relationships. It required preparation. It required that Richard Harrington had started making calls before Adrian's car had even left the driveway, which meant Richard had contingency plans that were already in place before Adrian arrived, which meant Richard had known Adrian was coming. Adrian picked up his own phone and called Marco back. "Find out how he knew," he said the moment Marco answered. Marco was quiet for a beat. "You think we have a leak?" "I think 6 major news outlets don't simultaneously run a prepared story with quotes and sourced photographs 6 hours after an event, unless someone had the story written before the event happened." He paused. "Find it." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for another moment. Then he walked down the hallway to the room where Lillian was staying. He knocked. "Come in," she said immediately. She was already awake, already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed with her notebook open in her lap. She looked up when he entered and read his face before he could say a word. "What happened?" he told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "He's done this before." "What do you mean?" "This exact pattern." She closed the notebook. "When I first found the financial records before he locked me away, I went to 2 people, a family attorney I trusted, and a journalist I had met at a charity event who covered financial crimes. Within 48 hours of me approaching them, my father had already reached them both. The attorney called me to say he had a conflict of interest and couldn't help. The journalist pulled the story before it ran." She looked at Adrian. 2 days. That was how fast he moved then. This time he had 6 hours and he did more damage. She paused. "He's gotten faster. Or more desperate," Adrian said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He looked at her. "The media is going to be at this building within the hour, possibly already outside." "I know. This changes our timeline." "I know that too." She stood up. "What do you need from me?" The directness of it, no panic, no spiral, no moment of paralysis, landed somewhere in Adrian's chest, in a way he didn't have time to examine. "I need to know if there's anything in those notebooks that can be verified quickly," he said. "Something concrete enough that our team can put it in front of a federal contact before the afternoon news cycle frames the story completely." She was already moving toward the desk where the notebooks were stacked. "Sit down," she said. "I'll find it." Daniel Yates arrived at 8. Rosa Kim was 20 minutes behind him, slightly out of breath with her phone pressed to her ear and her free hand already reaching for coffee before she had fully entered the room. "The story is everywhere," she said the moment she ended her call. "Network News picked it up 30 minutes ago. Social media is—" "I don't care about social media," Adrian said. "You need to care about it today," she said. "Because public perception is the weapon he's using right now, and if we don't—" "Rosa," he said it quietly. She stopped. "Tell me what we can do, not what we're facing. I can see what we're facing." She took a breath, reset. "Okay, we have 2 options that move fast enough to matter. Option 1, we release a statement through your legal team directly contradicting the kidnapping narrative and establishing that Lillian is with you voluntarily. That's clean and fast, but it's our word against his. And right now, his name is more reputable than yours in the court of public opinion." "What's option 2?" Lillian said from across the room. Everyone looked at her. She was sitting at the desk with the notebook spread open, a yellow legal pad beside her already working. Rosa looked at her for a moment. "Option 2 is Lillian appears publicly, voluntarily, on camera. She speaks for herself." The room was quiet. "That's faster than any statement we can draft," Rosa continued. "A live interview, or even a prepared video with Lillian speaking directly to the kidnapping claim. It collapses the narrative immediately. You can't kidnap someone who's standing in front of a camera, telling the world they're exactly where they want to be." Lillian kept writing on the legal pad for a moment. Then she set the pen down and looked up. "Schedule it," she said. "Lillian," Adrian said. "Schedule it," she said again, looking at Rosa. "Whoever you trust most. Whoever reaches the largest audience. Get it set up for this afternoon." "It means going public," Daniel said carefully. "About the room, about your father, about everything." "I know what it means," she said. "It's what I wanted anyway. The timeline just moved up." She looked at Adrian. "This is what he does. He tries to control the story before you can tell it yourself. The only counter is to tell your own story faster than he can bury it." Adrian looked at her. He thought about Richard Harrington sitting in his study the night before, making a call to a man whose number wasn't saved under any official name. I thought about 6 news outlets running the same story simultaneously in 6 hours. He thought about a woman who had been locked in a room for 7 years and had spent those years preparing for exactly this kind of fight, and who was now sitting across from him, calmly directing the counter-strategy, without a tremor in her voice. "Set it up," he said to Rosa. Rosa was already on her phone. The call from Thomas Harrington came at 9:15. Adrian didn't answer it, but Marco, monitoring his secondary phone, flagged it immediately. 5 minutes later, Thomas called again, then a third time. On the 4th call, Adrian picked up. "I told you not to call this number," he said. "I need to talk to Lillian," Thomas said. His voice sounded different from the previous night, less controlled, something fraying underneath it. "The story this morning that wasn't me. I want you to know that. I didn't approve those quotes. Your name is in the article, Thomas. My name is on quotes I didn't give. Someone on my father's PR team." He stopped. "Look, I know how this sounds, but I need to speak to my sister, please." Adrian looked across the room at Lillian, who had heard her brother's name and gone very still. He held the phone out toward her, not pushing, just offering. She looked at the phone. Then she stood up and walked over and took it from his hand. "Thomas," she said. "Whatever." Thomas said on the other end. Lillian's face went through something complicated. Not soft, not forgiving, but human. Like watching someone hold something they know might burn them and deciding not to let go. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't plan this." A pause. "That's not the same as being innocent, Thomas. You knew. You knew for years, and you did nothing." Another pause longer. Something Thomas was saying that Adrian couldn't hear. Then Lillian said, "No, stop. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen." Her voice was steady and precise. "You have a choice right now that you didn't have before, because before, there were no consequences to staying silent. Now, there are. So I'm going to give you until noon to decide whether you want to be on the right side of this, or whether you want to go down with it. That's 2.5 hours. She paused. "Don't call this phone again. If you decide to do the right thing, call Daniel Yates. His number is on our family's legal correspondence." She hung up. She held the phone for a moment without looking at anyone. Then she set it on the desk and sat back down and picked up her pen. "He sounded frightened," she said to no one in particular. "Good," Marco said from the doorway. "No," she said quietly. "Not good, just information." She looked down at the notebook. People who are frightened make fast decisions. Sometimes that's useful, and sometimes it makes them dangerous. She began writing again. "We'll see which one he is." At 11 o'clock, Rosa came in with her laptop and turned it so Adrian could see the screen. "I have the interview set," she said. "Eleanor Marsh, CNN. She's available at 2 this afternoon. She's known for being aggressive with her subjects but fair. She won't let Lillian be dismissed, but she won't let anything go unchallenged either." Rosa paused. Eleanor specifically asked if Lillian would be willing to address the kidnapping claim directly and on record. "Yes," Lillian said, before Adrian could respond. She also asked about the unlawful imprisonment allegation, whether Lillian intends to pursue criminal charges against Richard Harrington. The room went quiet. Lillian stopped writing. She sat for a moment with her pen held still above the page. This was the question she had not yet fully answered even to herself. She had said in the beginning that she didn't want revenge. She wanted truth. She wanted records. She wanted accountability for the people her father had harmed. Criminal charges against her own father were not revenge. They were consequence. But the line between those two things was thinner than she had expected it to feel when she was inside that room thinking through it in theory. "Tell Eleanor," Lillian said slowly, "that I will answer every question she asks. Honestly. On the record." She paused. "That includes that one." Rosa nodded and went back to her phone. Daniel, who had been listening from the corner, said quietly to Adrian, "If she publicly states intent to press criminal charges in a live interview, it creates a legal record. The U.S. Attorney's Office will have to respond. It forces the timeline." "I know," Adrian said. "It also means there's no walking it back." "She knows that too," Adrian said. Daniel looked at Lillian across the room. This thin woman with the careful posture and the worn notebooks and the particular composed intensity of someone who has survived something most people couldn't imagine. He had been a lawyer for 22 years. He had worked with victims of financial crimes and people who had been systematically defrauded, and people who had suffered profound personal betrayals at the hands of people they trusted. He thought he had developed a fairly reliable internal radar for whether someone was going to hold together under pressure. With Lillian Harrington, his radar was saying something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just that she would hold together, that she had never actually broken, not once. Through 7 years of everything designed to break her, she had bent. She was human. She had bent, but she had not broken, and there was a difference, and it was the most important difference in the world. He closed his folder. "Okay," he said simply. "Let's get her ready." At 12:14, Thomas Harrington called Daniel Yates. Adrian was in the middle of a briefing with his security team when Marco stepped into the room and held up 2 fingers, the signal they used for breaking development. Adrian excused himself and stepped into the hallway. "Thomas called Yates," Marco said. "He wants to cooperate." Adrian said nothing for a moment. "He has documents," Marco continued. "Financial records that he says he kept privately, copies of transactions he was directed to authorize that he knew were problematic. He kept them, he says, as insurance." Marco paused. "He's willing to turn them over in exchange for a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors." "He's protecting himself," Adrian said. "Yes." "What he has, is it significant?" Daniel thinks it fills in the gaps that Lillian's notebooks can't fully document on their own. The notebooks have conversations and amounts. Thomas has the actual transaction records to match them. Marco looked at Adrian. Together, they're not a case. They're a conviction. Adrian stood in the hallway and breathed for a moment. He thought about Thomas Harrington calling 3 times before he picked up. He thought about the fear in that voice. He thought about a man who had known his sister was in a room and had told himself for 7 years that it was complicated, that he had no choice, that the alternative was worse. The same story Richard had been telling himself, passed down like a family inheritance. And now, with the ground shifting under him, Thomas was making the rational calculation that his own survival required turning on his father. Adrian did not feel sympathy for Thomas Harrington, but he understood him. Understanding and sympathy were not the same thing, and Adrian Moretti had made his career on knowing the difference. "Tell Daniel to negotiate carefully," Adrian said. "Thomas gets cooperation consideration but no immunity. Whatever he did. That gets factored. He won't like that." "He doesn't have to like it. He has until 2 o'clock to decide before the interview goes live, and the leverage he currently has disappears." Marco nodded and stepped away. Adrian went back to the briefing. He told Lillian about Thomas at 1 o'clock 45 minutes before the interview. She was sitting in this chair where Rosa's team had done minimal preparation. She had refused anything elaborate, had accepted only a clean change of clothes and 10 minutes with someone who made sure she looked like herself on camera, rather than like someone who had just emerged from 7 years in a room, which she had. When Adrian told her about Thomas, she sat very still for a moment. "He's cooperating," she said. "Yes." "Because it's in his interest." "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap. "My mother called this morning," she said. Adrian went still. "Your mother?" "She's been in Connecticut all week. She saw the news." Lillian's voice was measured. Careful. The voice she used when something was landing, and she was managing it in real time. She called the house number. One of your staff told her where to reach me. She paused. She didn't know. About the room. She genuinely didn't know. Are you sure? She was crying in a way that I don't think is performable, Lillian said quietly. My mother is many things, but she's not that good an actress. She looked up. She and my father separated 4 years ago. She thought I had gone abroad. He told her the same story he told everyone. What did you say to her? I told her I was safe. I told her I would call her after the interview. She paused. I didn't have anything else to say to her yet. I need to think about what comes next with her before I say anything else. Adrian sat down across from her. You don't have to do the interview today, he said. We can find another way to... I'm doing the interview, she said. Flat. Final. Lillian. Adrian. She looked at him directly. My mother called. My brother is cooperating to save himself. My father released a story this morning that called me a victim, and you a criminal, and framed 7 years of what he did to me as something that happened to him. Her voice didn't shake, but it was tighter than it had been pulled close, controlled with effort. The only way any of that stops is if I walk into that room in 45 minutes and I tell the truth in front of cameras that reach every person in this country who has seen that story this morning. She held his gaze. So I'm doing the interview. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. Then she said more quietly, will you be there in the room, off camera? He hadn't expected the question, not because it was unusual, but because of how directly she asked it, without framing it, without making it smaller than it was, just asking for the thing she wanted. Yes, he said. She nodded once, and looked back at her hands. The interview lasted 41 minutes. Adrian stood just off camera the entire time, exactly as he'd said he would. He watched Eleanor Marsh go after Lillian with the professional precision of a journalist who had spent decades finding the gaps in prepared stories. Marsh was skilled and relentless, and she did not hold back. She questioned the timeline, challenged the details, pressed on the relationship with Adrian, returned 3 times to the kidnapping claim from multiple angles, pushed hard on the unlawful imprisonment allegation, and what evidence existed to support it. Lillian answered every single question. Clearly. Specifically. With dates, with names, with the particular authority of someone who had been thinking through their answers for 7 years and was finally being allowed to say them out loud. Halfway through, Eleanor Marsh asked, Your father has publicly described you as emotionally unstable. That this situation, as you've described it, was a form of care. How do you respond to that? And Lillian looked directly into the camera and said, I kept detailed records of everything that happened in that house for 7 years. I documented financial transactions. I recorded conversations. I built a timeline of my family's criminal operations from inside a locked room on the information I could hear through the walls. If that is what emotional instability looks like, then I suggest my father reconsider his definitions. Adrian, watching from off camera, felt something shift in the room. In Eleanor Marsh's expression. In the 2 producers standing behind the cameras. In himself. Because that was the moment, watching Lillian Harrington look into a camera and say the truest thing with the most precise words, in the clearest voice, that Adrian Moretti understood something he had been circling for 2 days without quite arriving at. This woman was not a person he had rescued. She was a person who had been waiting to rescue herself, and had done most of the work already, and had simply needed someone to open the door. That distinction mattered more than he had words for. When the interview ended, and Eleanor Marsh shook Lillian's hand and said quietly off camera, That was remarkable. Lillian said simply, Thank you. And then she turned and found Adrian's eyes across the room. She held his gaze for a moment. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. The story broke nationally at 3:15 when the interview clip aired. By 4 o'clock, Richard Harrington's publicist had released a brief statement saying the family had no further comment. By 4:30, the U.S. Attorney's Office had made an inquiry call to Daniel Yates. By 5, Thomas Harrington had signed a cooperation agreement. By 6, Richard Harrington had retained a criminal defense attorney. By 7 in the evening, Lillian Harrington's name had appeared on the front page of every major digital news outlet in America. Not as the forgotten daughter, not as the unstable heiress, not as the kidnapping victim, but as the woman who had spent 7 years building the case that brought down one of the most protected families in New York. Adrian sat across from her at the kitchen table as the notifications rolled in on everyone's phones, and she ate dinner, actually ate properly, a full plate, and he watched her read the headlines on the tablet Rosa had left behind. She was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up from the screen and said, "My father just lost control of the story." "Yes," Adrian said. "He's never lost control of the story before," she said. "Not once in 64 years. "I know. He won't stop," she said. "Losing the story doesn't mean he stops. It means he gets more dangerous." She set the tablet down. "The man he called last night after you left. The call I assume he made. Whatever contingency plan he keeps for situations like this, it's already in motion." Adrian looked at her. "How do you know he made a call?" he said carefully. "Because I know my father," she said. "Because that is what he does when the wall starts coming down. He doesn't accept the fall. He finds a way to make the fall land on someone else." She met his eyes. "The question is who?" Adrian said nothing. But he was already thinking about the man whose number Richard kept under no official name, in no official contact list. The same man he had used 7 years ago to make a problem disappear, and about the fact that right now, the problem Richard Harrington most needed to disappear was sitting at this kitchen table, eating dinner alive and documented, and on the front page of every major outlet in the country. The danger had not passed. It had changed shape, and it was moving toward them faster than the evening news. Marco came in at 11:40 that night and said 4 words. "We found the leak." Adrian set down his glass. Lillian looked up from the notebook she'd been reviewing. The room went the particular kind of quiet that happens when something you feared turns out to be real. Marco placed a single printed page on the table. A phone record, time-stamped, 48 hours before Adrian had walked into the Harrington estate. "Paul Sheridan," Marco said, "the forensic accountant." The man who had sat at that conference table that morning and cross-referenced Lillian's notebooks with such precision and apparent investment that Rosa Kim had looked at him with something close to admiration. The man who had been the first to identify the Vantage Capital connection to Adrian's father. The man who had also, 48 hours before any of that, made a 17-minute phone call to a number that traced back to a shell company connected to Harrington family legal operations. Adrian did not move for a long moment. Then he looked at Marco. "How long?" "We don't know the full timeline yet, but the call was made before we briefed him, which means someone tipped Richard that we were building a case, and Sheridan confirmed details." Marco paused. "He told them enough for Richard to have the counter-story ready to release within hours of your visit." "He was already inside the team," Lillian said quietly. "Yes," Marco said. She was looking at the phone record with an expression that was not surprise, not quite, but something close to the exhaustion of a person who has been proven right about something they desperately wish they were wrong about. "My father doesn't just react," she said. "He plants. He plants people before he needs them. By the time you realize someone is compromised, they've already done everything they needed to do." Adrian looked at the phone record. He thought about Sheridan in that conference room going through the notebooks with practiced efficiency. He thought about the moment Sheridan had identified the Vantage Capital connection, and how smoothly, how helpfully it had landed. "He pointed us to the connection," Adrian said. "Not to Marco, to himself working it out. The Vantage Capital entry in the notebook, he found it too fast. He knew where to look because he already knew it was there." "How was directing what we saw?" Lillian said. "Showing you what Richard wanted you to focus on. So we'd spend our energy on the financial fraud angle, and not the—" She stopped. Adrian looked at her. "Not the what?" She was quiet for a moment. "The third notebook," she said. "The one Rosa and Daniel spent the least time on. I need to go through it again." She was already moving toward the desk. "Lillian," Adrian said. "Give me 10 minutes," she said, and she sat down and opened the notebook and started reading with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. They just haven't confirmed where it's hidden yet. Marco looked at Adrian. Adrian gave him the look that meant, "Handle Sheridan quietly," and Marco left the room without another word. 8 minutes later, Lillian said, "Come here." She had the third notebook open to an entry from roughly 3 years ago. The handwriting was tighter than usual. She had been economizing space, filling a page that was almost full with smaller letters. She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. Adrian read it. He read it twice. Then he sat down in the chair next to her because standing suddenly felt like too much effort. The entry documented a conversation she had overheard between Richard Harrington and another man, a man she had identified by voice from previous overheard conversations as Victor Crane, Richard's primary legal architect. The conversation had been about what Richard called the Moretti loose end, not the shipping company. That had been resolved years before this entry. The loose end was Adrian himself. The entry documented Richard Harrington saying with the particular calm of a man who has said frightening things for so long, they no longer feel frightening to him, that Adrian Moretti's growing criminal empire presented a potential future threat, and that steps should be taken to preempt that threat before it became an active problem. The entry documented Victor Crane asking what kind of steps. The entry documented Richard Harrington saying the kind that don't leave paper trails. And then, this was the part that had made Lillian's handwriting get even smaller, as if she had been trying to make the words take up less space. The entry documented Richard Harrington saying that he had already retained someone appropriate, that the matter was being managed, that it had been managed for the past 18 months already. "He's been having me watched," Adrian said. "For at least 3 years," Lillian said. "Possibly longer." Sheridan was the most recent. There were others before him. She turned to a page earlier in the notebook. "I heard a name once, about 2 years ago. A man my father called when he needed what he called active intervention." She pointed to a name she had written carefully in capital letters and then circled twice. Garrett Welsh. Adrian looked at the name. Marco appeared in the doorway. Adrian looked up. "Tell me you know that name," Adrian said. Marco's expression answered before his words did. He knew the name, and the expression said that knowing it was not a comfortable thing. "Garrett Welsh," Marco said. "He operates out of 3 cities, not a conventional hired man. He's more strategic. He specializes in situations that need to look like something other than what they are." He paused. "We've tracked him peripherally twice in the last 5 years. Never been able to place him directly on anything. Richard Harrington retained him," Adrian said. "Possibly 3 years ago. Certainly still active." Marco was quiet for a beat that lasted exactly long enough to communicate the weight of what that meant. If Welsh is active on this, the leak from Sheridan wasn't just about the media story. "No," Adrian said. "It was reconnaissance. Welsh needed to know what we had, who was in the room, and what our next moves were before he decided how to approach it." The room was completely still for a moment. Then Lillian said very quietly, "He's not after the documents." Both men looked at her. "Welsh," she said. "My father wouldn't spend 3 years maintaining someone like that just to protect financial records. If he wanted the documents killed, there are other ways: lawyers, regulatory interference, political pressure." She looked at Adrian. "You said it yourself 2 days ago. Richard doesn't destroy things carelessly. He always wants something specific." She closed the notebook. "Welsh isn't here to stop the documents. He's here to remove the witness." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room full of people who have just understood something they can't undo. "You," Adrian said. Not a question. Understanding arriving like something physical. "Me," Lillian confirmed. Her voice was steady, completely steady. The steadiness of someone who has had time to consider their own danger and make peace with the abstract version of it, and who is now confronting the concrete version without the luxury of abstraction. "With me gone," she said, "the notebooks are records without a voice. Without my testimony, the legal case becomes significantly harder to prosecute. Without me available to testify about the overheard conversations, the notebooks are circumstantial." She paused. My father has always understood that documents are controllable. People are the real variable. Adrian stood up. Marco, he said. Full protocol. Tonight. Already started, Marco said, and he was gone. Adrian looked at Lillian. She was sitting with her hands flat on the closed notebook, looking at the wall. Not panicking. Not performing calm, either. This was something different, something more internal. The look of a person running calculations behind their eyes. You're not afraid, he said. I'm afraid, she said without looking at him. I'm just not letting it make decisions for me. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. She turned to look at him then. And there was something in her expression that was complicated, not disbelieving, but not simply accepting either. The expression of someone who has had promises made to them before, and understands from experience that promises and outcomes are different things. I know you believe that, she said. I don't say things I don't mean, he said. I know that too, she said. I'm just... She paused. 7 years ago I thought I was safe too, right up until the moment I wasn't. He sat back down across from her, closer this time. What happened 7 years ago, he said, is not what is happening now. Then you were alone. You had no one who knew, no one who was looking. He held her gaze. That is not the situation tonight. She looked at him. He didn't look away. After a moment she nodded, not the nod of someone fully reassured, the nod of someone deciding to accept the best available information and move forward with it because the alternative was to stop moving. And stopping was something Lillian Harrington did not seem biologically capable of. Okay, she said. Then tell me what full protocol means because I want to understand what we're doing. They moved her at 2 in the morning. Not because the current building was compromised. Marco's team had found nothing to indicate Welsh had identified the location yet. But Adrian had learned a long time ago that the best time to move was before you needed to, not after, and tonight was not a night for any delay in acting on what they knew. The new location was a building Adrian owned under a company name that had no visible connection to him. A clean address registered through 3 layers of corporate structure that even his own legal team hadn't known about until tonight. He had places like this in 4 cities. He had learned the necessity of them from watching other people not have them. In the car. Lillian sat next to him rather than across. Not close, there was still space between them, but the geometry of it was different than previous rides. Less adversarial, less careful. Something that had shifted so gradually over 3 days that neither of them had exactly noticed it happening. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The man you were, she said, before all of this, before you built what you built, what would he think of tonight? He was quiet for a moment. My father's son, he said slowly, would think I had become something my father wouldn't recognize. And what do you think? He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. I think my father's son built something he could survive with. I think sometimes survival requires becoming things that aren't... He paused. Aren't what you'd choose if you had other choices. Do you believe that? She asked. Or is it what you've told yourself? He looked at her. She held his gaze without apology. That was one of the things about Lillian Harrington. She asked the real question directly, and then she waited for a real answer, and she did not fill the silence with softening language while she waited. Both, he said finally. At different times. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what Richard did to your father, and what he did to me, it's the same mechanism. He found what someone cared about most. Your father cared about his company, his integrity, his ability to provide. I cared about the truth about doing the right thing. He identified those things, and then he used them to remove us. She paused. He turns the best things about people into the weapons he uses against them. Yes, Adrian said. The man you became, she said. After your father died. The empire, the power, the untouchability that was you, making sure nobody could use what you cared about against you again. He looked at her. By not caring about anything, she said, gently. Not as an accusation, as an observation. The car moved through the dark city. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "I know," she said, just as quietly. "I did a version of the same thing, in that room. You build walls strong enough to keep the pain out, and then one day you realize you've built them strong enough to keep everything out." She looked out the window. "I don't want to do that anymore." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Neither do I." Neither of them said anything else until the car stopped. At 4 in the morning, Marco knocked on Adrian's door. "Welsh made contact," he said. Adrian was dressed and on his feet in under a minute. "With who?" "With us," Marco said, and something in his expression was different. Not afraid. Marco didn't do afraid, but calibrated in a particular way that meant the situation had moved into territory he was taking seriously. He sent a message through a channel that he should not have known existed, which means his information on our operations is more current than we thought. "Sheridan," Adrian said. "Sheridan confirmed that channel in the last week, before we identified him." Marco held out his phone. "The message is brief." Adrian read it. 3 sentences. "I'm not here for the woman. I'm not here for you. I'm here for the notebooks. Hand them over and I walk away. Everyone goes home." Adrian read it twice. Then he handed the phone back. "He's lying," Lillian said from the hallway. Both men turned. She was standing in the doorway in the dark holding her phone, and from the clarity in her eyes, it was obvious she had not been sleeping either. "He's not after the notebooks," she said. "Notebooks can be copied, digitized, already filed in multiple locations. Any competent operator knows destroying physical documents at this stage accomplishes nothing." She looked at Adrian. "This message is designed to do one thing." "Tell me," Adrian said. "It's designed to get you to respond," she said. "To open a communication channel. The moment you engage with him, he knows more about where you are, what your decision-making process looks like, and how much time he has." She paused. "Don't respond." Marco looked at Adrian. "Don't respond," Adrian confirmed. Marco nodded. "Gone again." Adrian looked at Lillian. "You should sleep." "So should you," she said. "I don't sleep," she said. "I know you don't. I know you've been running on whatever you run on for 3 days. But tomorrow is going to require you to be sharper than tonight. And tonight you're already sharper than most people are at their best, so there's room to let yourself be human for 4 hours. She held his gaze. "The notebooks are digitized. Rosa has copies. Daniel has copies. The U.S. Attorney's Office has received the initial filing. The story is public. Welsh taking us out tonight doesn't stop anything anymore." He looked at her. "I've been running threat assessments in my head all night," she continued. "And I keep arriving at the same place. The most dangerous moment has passed. He had maximum leverage before the interview, before Thomas cooperated, before the federal inquiry. Right now, every action he takes makes Richard's situation worse, not better, because every action creates evidence of consciousness of guilt." She paused. "Welsh is smart enough to know that, which is why the message was about the notebooks and not about us. He's already recalibrating." Adrian studied her face. "You've been doing threat assessments," he said. "All night," she confirmed. "In your head." "I don't have a whiteboard." He almost laughed. It surprised him, the nearness of it, the way it rose and then receded when he pressed it back down out of habit. "There's a whiteboard in the second room," he said. "I know," she said. "I found it 2 hours ago." He looked past her into the hallway and saw on the board she had pulled into position a handwritten map of decision nodes and timeline markers and annotated risk assessments that covered most of the available surface. He looked back at her. "Get some sleep," she said again. "I'll be here when you wake up." Something about those words, the simplicity of them, the complete matter-of-factness of them, landed somewhere Adrian hadn't expected. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way significant things sometimes arrive, like a door opening that you hadn't realized was closed. He nodded once. He went to sleep. He woke at 8 to Marco's voice through the door. "Richard Harrington was arrested 40 minutes ago." Adrian sat up. "I was dressed and in the main room in under 3 minutes." Lillian was already there, standing at the window, with her phone reading. She looked up when he came in. "Federal agents," she said. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved faster than Daniel expected. The cooperation agreement with Thomas, plus the initial filing, plus the public pressure from the interview. She paused. They had enough to move. Adrian looked at Marco. "Welsh. Gone," Marco said. "Pulled out sometime in the night. No further contact." He paused. "His client was just arrested. The contract is presumably void." The room was quiet for a moment. Adrian looked at Lillian. She was looking at her phone. At the news alert, the photograph of Richard Harrington being escorted out of the Harrington estate by federal agents, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his composure finally and visibly broken the expression on his face. Not the fear of a man caught in something, but the particular shattered look of a man who has discovered for the first time in 64 years that there is no available exit. She looked at that photograph for a long time. Adrian watched her watch it. He waited to see what it would do to her, what it would bring up, whether it would break anything loose, whether the controlled composure would finally find its limit. What he saw was not what he expected. She exhaled, not with relief, not with triumph, just exhaled, like someone setting down something heavy, like someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that putting it down doesn't feel victorious. It just feels like the absence of something that has been there constantly, and the body needs a moment to understand what the absence means. "It's done," she said, quietly, to herself as much as to him. "Not completely," he said. "There's still the prosecution, Thomas's testimony, your testimony. This goes on for a while yet." "I know," she said. "I know all of that." She finally looked up from the phone. "But this part, the part where he's untouchable, and I'm the one who disappeared, that part is done." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That part is done." She set the phone face down on the table. Then she said something he did not expect. "I owe you an honest answer to a question you asked me 3 days ago." He waited. "You asked me if I was afraid," she said, "when you found me in the room, and I said I was afraid, but I wasn't letting it make decisions for me." She paused. "What I didn't tell you was what I was most afraid of. It wasn't Welsh. It wasn't my father's lawyers. It wasn't the story he would try to tell." She met his eyes. "I was most afraid that I would get out and discover that 7 years had taken so much from me that I didn't know how to—" She stopped, found the words. How to be in the world, how to trust it, how to trust the people in it. He said nothing. He just held her gaze and let her finish. "I'm still afraid of that," she said. "But less than I was 3 days ago." Something in him shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly. The way bedrock shifts deep structural permanent. "Less than 3 days ago," he said, "is enough to work with." She looked at him, and for the first time since he had found her sitting on the edge of that bed in that locked room, Lillian Harrington smiled. Not the sharp, almost smile from before, not the controlled professional composure she wore in conference rooms. A real one. Small and true and slightly uncertain, like something that hadn't had much practice but hadn't forgotten how. "Yes," she said. "It is." From the corner of the room, Marco appeared with 2 cups of coffee. He set them on the table between them. He looked at Adrian once very briefly, with an expression that contained 8 years of working for this man and understanding him better than most people ever would. And then he left the room without a word. Adrian picked up one of the cups. Lillian picked up the other. They didn't say anything for a moment. The city was audible outside, real and loud and continuous, full of 8 million people moving through their morning without any awareness of what had just concluded in this room. Then Lillian said, "You came to the house 3 nights ago to destroy my family." "Yes," he said, "and instead you destroyed my father's criminal empire, protected my identity, provided federal authorities with a 7-year evidentiary record, neutralized a professional threat, and gave me the first safe place I've slept in 7 years." She paused. "That's a significant deviation from the original plan." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Are you complaining?" "No," she said. "I'm documenting." He almost laughed again. This time he let it happen quiet, brief, real. Dangerous habit, he said. Documenting everything. It's how I survived, she said. I know, he said. I'm beginning to think it might be how I did too. She looked at him. He looked back. The morning continued outside, indifferent and bright, while inside this room, two people who had come from opposite directions of the same catastrophe sat with their coffee cups and the specific quiet understanding of people who have been through something together that changes the shape of what comes next. Neither of them knew exactly what that shape was yet, but for the first time in a very long time, for both of them, not knowing felt like possibility instead of danger. And that, for now, was everything. Across the city, in a federal holding facility on the east side, Richard Harrington sat in a room that was not his study, at a table that was not his desk, in a chair he could not choose to leave. And for the first time in 64 years, there was no phone to pick up, no story to file, no door to lock from the outside, just a man, and the weight of everything he had done, and the slowly arriving understanding that the woman he had tried to erase had outlasted him. Not with power, not with money, not with any of the weapons he had spent his life collecting, but with the one thing he had never understood. The truth kept carefully, patiently, stubbornly for 7 years. Written in 5 small notebooks by a woman he had underestimated. The way men like Richard Harrington always underestimate the people they believe they have silenced. The prosecution lasted 11 months. Not 11 months of waiting. 11 months of active grinding. Relentless legal machinery, moving through every layer of what Richard Harrington had built and dismantling it piece by piece with the particular thoroughness that federal prosecutors apply when they have a strong case, motivated witnesses, and a defendant whose public fall has made the case politically valuable. Lillian testified 3 times. Once in the grand jury proceeding. Once in a deposition that lasted 2 full days and covered every notebook entry in sequential order. And once at trial on the stand in open court in front of Richard Harrington's defense team, and Richard Harrington himself, who sat at the defense table and watched his daughter testify against him with an expression that had passed through anger, and then through something that tried to be contempt, and finally settled into a kind of blankness that was harder to look at than either of the other two. She never looked away from him when she answered questions. That was the part that people remembered afterward. Journalists who covered the trial, the attorneys on both sides, the federal judge who had presided over hundreds of cases and said privately to his clerk after Lillian's first day on the stand that he had never seen a witness with that quality of composure. Not detachment, not coldness. Composure. The kind that is built, not given, earned, not inherited, forged, specifically in the conditions that were designed to destroy it. The defense tried 4 separate times to rattle her. They questioned her mental stability. She directed them calmly to her 7 years of dated and documented records and asked which specific entry they'd like to challenge. They questioned her motivations. She said without hesitation that her motivation was accurate documentation, and she would welcome them to show the court any specific inaccuracy in anything she had submitted. They questioned her relationship with Adrian Moretti and whether it affected her objectivity. And that was the only moment in 3 days of testimony where something flickered behind her eyes, brief and controlled, before she said that her testimony concerned documented facts which existed independently of her relationship with anyone, and she would encourage the defense to direct the court to any factual error if they had found one. They hadn't found one, because there weren't any. Adrian sat in the public gallery for every day of testimony. Not prominently. Not in a way that drew attention or created a story. He sat near the back and he watched, and on the days when Lillian stepped down from the stand after hours of cross-examination and walked past the gallery toward the exit. She never looked for him. She didn't need to look. She knew he was there, and knowing was enough. Thomas Harrington testified under his cooperation agreement. His testimony was specific, detailed, and visibly costly to him. You could see it in the way he held himself on the stand, the careful containment of a man who understood that every word he said was simultaneously the thing saving him and the thing he would have to live with for the rest of his life. He confirmed everything. The financial structures, the regulatory manipulation, the payments to Vantage Capital, the deliberate targeting of Adrian's father's company. He confirmed the room. He confirmed 7 years of knowing and staying silent, which was in some ways the most damaging testimony of all, because it was the testimony about a choice rather than a circumstance. Halfway through Thomas's third day on the stand, Richard Harrington's lead defense attorney requested a brief recess. During that recess, Richard Harrington fired his entire legal team. The courtroom understood what that meant before the afternoon session resumed. Daniel Yates, sitting beside Adrian in the gallery, leaned over and said quietly, "He's going to change his plea." "Why now?" Adrian said. "Because Thomas just finished," Daniel said. Richard has spent 11 months believing Thomas would pull back at the last moment. That whatever was left of family loyalty would reassert itself. That Thomas would find a way to soften it when it came to it. He paused. Thomas didn't soften it. Richard just watched his son put the last nail in with his own hands, and now he knows there's no version of a jury trial that ends well for him. They reconvened at 2:15. Richard Harrington stood up slowly, with the careful dignity of a man who has decided that the only thing left he can control is his posture, and through his hastily retained new counsel, entered a guilty plea on 11 of the 14 federal counts. The courtroom made a sound that wasn't quite noise, more like a collective exhale. The sound of something enormous settling. Lillian, sitting at the prosecution's table as a cooperating witness, did not move. Adrian, watching from the gallery, watched her not move. He watched the stillness in her shoulders, the way her hands were flat on the table in front of her. The same position he had seen them in that first morning at his kitchen table at the conference table with the lawyers, at every moment when something landed and she processed it without letting it knock her sideways. He had come to understand that stillness in 11 months of watching it. It was not the stillness of someone suppressing something. It was the stillness of someone who has integrated so much over so long that even the enormous things arrive somewhere that is prepared for them. Richard Harrington had tried to make her disappear. Instead, he had made her immovable. She found Adrian outside the courthouse afterward, not the front steps. Neither of them had any interest in the cameras and reporters that were assembled there processing the plea, but around the side where Marco had a car waiting and the afternoon light came in flat and gray and real. She walked up to him and stopped about 3 feet away and looked at him for a moment. "It's over," she said. "The plea," he said, "not the sentencing. I know, but the—" She searched for the word. "The fighting. The part where I had to hold it together because it wasn't finished yet." She exhaled. "That part is over." He looked at her. 11 months. He had seen her in conference rooms and courtroom hallways, and his kitchen at 7 in the morning, and once unexpectedly, in the lobby of the building where she had moved 3 months after Richard's arrest, when he had been walking past, and she had been coming out, and they had both stopped at the same moment, with the particular surprise of people whose lives have become adjacent in a way that still catches them off guard sometimes. In 11 months, he had watched her testify, consult with federal prosecutors, give 4 additional media interviews, establish the legal framework for what she was already calling the foundation, navigate a relationship with her mother that was fragile and real, and nothing like what either of them wished it had been, but something they were both willing to work with, and speak twice publicly about unlawful imprisonment in ways that had generated proposed legislative action in 2 states. In 11 months, he had not told her what watching all of that had done to him. He was not historically a man who led with that kind of information. "How are you?" he said, which was not what he meant to say, but was true. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding how honest to be. "I cried in the car on the way here this morning," she said. He hadn't known that. "Why?" "Because I tried to remember what I thought this day would feel like when I was in that room," she said. "When I was 3 years in, 4 years in, and I would let myself imagine that someday there would be a day like today. That it would actually happen." She paused. "I couldn't remember what I imagined it would feel like. I just remember that I made myself believe it was possible because the alternative was—" She stopped. "Don't," he said, quietly. "You don't have to finish that." She looked at him. "I know," she said. They stood outside the courthouse in the flat November light and said nothing for a moment. In the distance, the front steps noise of reporters and cameras continued processing the story, adding it to the permanent record of a day that would be referenced in financial crime cases and legal proceedings for years to come. "I want to ask you something," Lillian said. "Ask." "The foundation," she said. "I've been building the structure for 6 months. It's almost ready to operate. We're going to focus on people who've been silenced by powerful institutions, by families, by systems that decided they were more convenient disappeared than present." She paused. "I want to ask if you'll be on the advisory board." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't need me on an advisory board," he said. "I know I don't need you," she said. "I'm asking if you want to be." He looked at her. The distinction she had made was careful and intentional, and she knew that he knew it. "Yes," he said. She nodded once. Something in her shoulders released slightly. Not relief, exactly, but the relaxation of something that had been held in careful suspension. "Good," she said. Then after a pause, "Marco told me you turned down the Delgado operation last month." Adrian was still for a moment. "Marco talks too much. Marco respects you enormously, and occasionally shares information he thinks I should have." She held his gaze. "You turned down a significant contract, one you would have taken 18 months ago." He said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain it," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "It didn't sit right," he said finally. "Simple. True. Things that didn't sit right used to not stop you," she said. "No," he agreed. "They didn't." She looked at him. The November light was doing something specific to the quality of her face, making the 11 months visible in a way that the courtroom's fluorescent indifference hadn't. She looked like someone who had aged and unaged simultaneously. Older in the ways that come from going through things. Younger in the ways that come from finally putting them down. "I'm not going to ask you what changed," she said. "I think I already know." "Do you?" he said. "You started caring about something again," she said. "And it made the things that didn't sit right not sit right." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Something like that," he said. She almost smiled. The real one, small and true, slightly uncertain, the same one he had first seen the morning after Richard's arrest, which had surprised him then, and still had that quality of surprise every time, like something that hadn't fully learned yet, that it was allowed to just exist without apology. "Come on," she said. "Marco's waiting." 3 weeks after the plea, the sentencing landed 22 years on the 11 counts. Federal mandatory minimums. Richard Harrington would be 77 years old before any parole consideration. Thomas received 4 years under his cooperation agreement. He would serve 2. He had already sold the family home, a decision that Lillian said nothing about publicly and privately, felt nothing clean about, just the complicated residue of a family that had been broken for so long that its pieces no longer fit any recognizable shape. Their mother. Margaret had moved to a smaller house in Connecticut and had called Lillian every Sunday for 11 months without missing a single week. The calls were sometimes 40 minutes and sometimes 8 minutes, and sometimes mostly silence on one end or the other, and none of them had solved anything, and all of them had built something. Something fragile and real and ongoing. Lillian had learned in that room that the truth doesn't always arrive as resolution. Sometimes it arrives as a new set of questions you're finally allowed to ask out loud. She was still asking some of them. She was okay with that. The foundation opened its doors on the first Monday of December. It was called The Record. The name was Lillian's, and it meant exactly what it said. The act of documentation, the act of refusing to let things be buried, the stubborn insistence that what happened to people deserved to be written down and preserved and used. The first 3 cases they took involved a former pharmaceutical employee who had been systematically discredited after reporting safety violations. A woman whose medical records had been altered by a hospital to avoid malpractice liability, and a family whose legal case against a real estate developer had been buried when the developer purchased the law firm representing them. Lillian worked from 8 in the morning until sometimes 9 at night, with a focused energy that her small staff initially found intimidating, and then came to understand as simply what she was. Someone who had had something to do for a very long time, and had finally been given the full-sized version of the tools to do it with. Adrian came by on Thursdays. Not every Thursday, not on a schedule, but often enough that the staff knew to have coffee ready and to let him up without calling ahead, and often enough that the Thursday rhythm had become something both of them moved around without discussing it as a thing. He sat in the chair across from her desk, and they talked. About the cases, about logistics, about the congressional hearing she was preparing to testify at in the spring regarding unlawful confinement in domestic contexts, about his own operations, which had been contracting steadily in certain directions and expanding in others that were quieter and less visible, and that Marco described in his private capacity as a man who had worked for Adrian for 9 years as a version of the business he was more comfortable with. They talked about their fathers sometimes. His and how the shipping company's regulatory contracts had been quietly restored to the Moretti family estate as part of the federal remediation process, a thing that Adrian had sat with for several weeks before he understood what he felt about it, which was not triumph and not grief exactly, but something in between that he thought might be the feeling of a story being completed rather than one. Hers, and how she had visited Richard Harrington in federal prison once in the 3rd month of his sentence and come back and not talked about it for 2 days, and then told Adrian over coffee on a Thursday that she had gone because she needed to see the room he was in. Not for satisfaction, not for closure, just to know that the room was real, that it existed, that it had walls and a lock and was approximately as small as she had always suspected it would feel to him. She had not gone back. She did not plan to. On a Thursday in February, 11 months after the foundation opened, Lillian looked up from the file she was reading and said, "Can I tell you something?" "Yes," Adrian said. She set the file down. She looked at him in the direct way she had, no preamble, no careful approach, just the thing itself. "I spent 7 years in that room believing the hardest part was going to be getting out," she said. "I thought that once I was out, the rest would be not easy, but the hard part would be done." She paused. "I was wrong." He waited. "The hardest part was learning to stop waiting for the room to come back," she said. "Every good thing that happened in the last year, every time something went right, every time I felt safe, every time I thought maybe this is going to be okay, there was this reflex, this thing underneath it that said, don't trust it, don't settle into it, because last time you felt safe the door locked from the outside, and it was 3 years before anyone opened it." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying I'm over it," she said. "I'm saying I'm getting better at catching the reflex before it makes decisions for me. And I wanted you to know that because—" She paused, finding the precise words the way she always found precise words. "Because I think you have a version of the same reflex. And I think you've been getting better at catching it too. And I thought someone should say that out loud." The office was quiet. Adrian sat with what she had said for a moment. He didn't deflect it. He didn't minimize it. He sat with it the way she had taught him, without being aware she was teaching him simply by consistently doing it herself. Sitting with difficult, true things until they settled. "I do," he said. "Have that reflex." "I know," she said. "When did you figure that out?" "Around month 4, she said. "When you turned down the Delgado operation and then showed up on a Thursday 2 days later and didn't mention it. I watched you not mention it. And I thought he's catching the reflex. He's deciding not to let it make the decision." He looked at her. "You watch me very carefully," he said. "I watch everything carefully," she said. "It's how I survived." A beat. "But with you, it's not surveillance. It's not self-protection." She held his gaze. "I think you know what it is." He did know. He had known for a while. He had been catching that particular reflex, the one that said, "Don't name it. Don't make it real. Real things can be taken for several months with variable success." "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said. Before he finished. Before he found the words. "I haven't said it yet," he said. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I already know. I've known for a while. I just wanted you to know that I know so you weren't carrying it around on your own." She tilted her head slightly. "That's the thing about people who keep records. We notice when things are true before they've been said out loud." He looked at her for a long moment. "I came to your father's house," he said slowly, "to destroy your family. That was the whole of it. That was everything I had been building toward for 10 years. And then I found you in a room, and you asked me if I was there to hurt them and everything." He paused. Everything I had built the plan around stopped making the sense it had made for a decade. "I know," she said softly. "I don't know how to say what the last year has been," he said. "I don't have a clean version of it." "It doesn't need to be clean," she said. "Nothing true is completely clean." He looked at her. "I love you," he said. Simple. Direct. The way he said everything that mattered without excess, without performance, with only the weight of the thing itself. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. And then quieter, "I love you too." Neither of them moved for a moment. The office continued around them, the faint sound of staff in the hallway. The city outside, the continuous ordinary machinery of the world that had no awareness of what had just been said in this room. Then Lillian picked up her file again. Adrian picked up his coffee. And they continued. Not because the moment was small, because it wasn't. But because that was what they were, two people who had survived things by continuing, and who had learned slowly and imperfectly and together that continuing towards something good was different from continuing in spite of something terrible, and that the difference was everything. That spring, Lillian testified before a congressional subcommittee on unlawful confinement and institutional abuse of power. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She used specific language, specific dates, specific names. She did not cry, and she did not perform strength. She simply told the truth with the precision of someone who has kept the truth alive for a very long time and knows exactly what it weighs. When she finished, the committee chair, a woman from Ohio, who had been in Congress for 18 years and who had the particular weariness of someone who has sat in too many hearings where people said important things and nothing changed, said quietly into her microphone, "Ms. Harrington, I want to thank you for the extraordinary clarity and courage of your testimony today." Lillian said, "Thank you, but I want to be clear that clarity is not the same as courage. I kept records because it was the only thing I could do. What takes courage is what comes next. Making sure that what I documented is used to change the conditions that made the documentation necessary in the first place." The hearing room was very quiet. Then the committee chair said, "Yes, exactly right." In the public gallery, Adrian Moretti sat in the back row. Not because he needed to be there. Not because Lillian needed him there. She didn't need anyone there. She had established that capacity so thoroughly over the past year that it was one of the fundamental facts about her. He was there because he wanted to be. Because he had come to understand slowly, and without any of the fanfare he might have expected such an understanding to arrive, with that wanting to be somewhere because someone you love is there. That was not weakness. That it was not the kind of caring that could be used against you. That the thing his father's destruction had taught him, that caring was a liability, that love was a vulnerability, that the only safe posture was untouchability, was a lesson that had kept him alive and kept him empty simultaneously, and that the emptiness had cost him more than the vulnerability ever would. He sat in the back of that hearing room and listened to Lillian Harrington speak, and when people would later ask him in the years that followed in the various contexts where this story would be told and retold, and eventually become the kind of story that outlasts the people who lived it, when they asked him how a man who had built a criminal empire on the premise of destroying a family had ended up beside the woman from that family, he always gave the same answer. He said, "I went looking for someone to make pay." He said, "Instead, I found someone who reminded me that the point was never to make someone pay." He said, "The point was always the truth." And then he said the thing that was truest, and that he had arrived at not quickly or cleanly, but across 11 months of watching a woman with 5 worn notebooks and 7 years of silence relearn how to take up space in the world. Some people survive by becoming harder. She survived by becoming clearer. And there is no version of me that is not better for understanding the difference. That was the story. Not the story of a mafia boss who found redemption through love that was too simple, too clean, too untrue to the difficulty of what had actually happened. The real story was two people who had been broken in different ways by the same mechanism, who had found each other in the wreckage and who had chosen every day imperfectly with the full knowledge of how much choosing costs and how quickly it can be taken away to build something that the people who had hurt them could never reach. Not because they were beyond hurt, because they had decided that what they were building was worth more than what they were protecting themselves from. Richard Harrington was in a federal prison in upstate New York. The notebooks were in the Library of Congress as part of a documented case study in financial fraud and unlawful confinement. The Record Foundation had in its first year restored public documentation to 31 individuals whose cases had been systematically buried by institutions more powerful than them. And in a hearing room in Washington, D.C., a woman who had been locked in a room for 7 years and had spent those years refusing to stop believing that the truth was worth keeping. That woman was speaking on the record in public in her own name. Not as a victim. Not as someone's forgotten daughter. Not as the woman a powerful man had tried to erase. As herself. Fully, permanently, irreversibly herself. And that was something. No locked door. No manufactured story. No hired operative. No amount of money or power or carefully constructed silence could ever undo. The truth had been kept. And now it was free.